to the Constitutional Clarion. As the coronation is only a week away at the time of filming this, I thought I'd make a few videos about the coronation, looking at its history, which is quite interesting, its idiosyncrasies, which are extensive, and its significance. What does it all mean? For this video, however, I'm going to start off on the question of, well, what is it a coronation of? Is it a coronation of King Charles as King of the United Kingdom only, or does it actually involve crowning the King as King of Australia? Well, first point to make is that as a matter of law, it doesn't make him king at all. Of course, Charles became king upon the death of his mother, and how did he become king? He became king by law. So the real issue is, what is the law that applies and how does it apply? But then what's a coronation for? Well, the coronation is more of a symbolic exercise. It's both a religious exercise, so there's an anointing of the king, but it's also an exercise of public recognition. And public recognition, of course, was really important when it comes to being a monarch, because you need to be accepted by the public in order to be able to fulfill the role. If we travel back in history to Christmas Day on 1066, we would have seen the coronation of William the Conqueror. Now, as his name suggests, he was a conqueror. And there was a quite uneasy relationship between the Anglo-Saxons, who had been conquered by the Normans. And in order to cement his relationship, this coronation ceremony involved the Anglo-Saxons being invited to Westminster Abbey to proclaim their acceptance of the king as their king. Now, one of the critical parts of the coronation ceremony is known as the recognition. And in that part of the ceremony, the king will face to the north and then to the south and to the east and to the west, to the different parts of his congregation, and each part will then loudly declare and acclaim this person as their king by shouting, "God save the king." Now, when this happened in Westminster in 1066, the Norman soldiers who were outside the abbey thought, with this roar of the crowd from inside, that there was some kind of an insurrection against their king, and curiously decided to respond by burning down the houses of the Anglo-Saxons who lived around the abbey. So amidst the smoke and the screaming from the people whose houses were being burnt down, the soldiers then pulled out their swords and raced into the abbey to then defend their king after spending time burning down houses, only to find that the Anglo-Saxons then thought, "Oh my goodness, it's a trap. We've all been brought in here to be massacred," and responded then by running outside and then facing the Norman soldiers in a bit of a battle outside the abbey. So the coronation went on inside the abbey, while outside there was smoke and screaming and quite a lot of fighting. So you can see in the past the recognition didn't quite go as planned, rather hoping and expecting that King Charles's recognition as part of his coronation will not be quite so eventful. Okay, so the recognition is all about public acceptance and acknowledgement of a person as king. But coming back to that legal question of law, whose law is it? Is it the British law that determines who is the king and gets crowned, or is it law of the other places that he's king of? The law of Tuvalu, the law of Canada, the law of Australia. Now, I concede I did a longer version of this video explaining all that, and then discovered I'd bored myself to death. So I'm not going to give you the boring version. Here's the short, sharp version. The gist of it is, those British laws came and became part of the law of its various colonies when they were settled. Originally, it applied as a law that you couldn't change locally, a law of paramount force. That's now disappeared. The crown has become divisible, meaning there are separate crowns for Australia, Tuvalu, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, etc. And that the law in relation to that is now dealt with separately by each particular country and how its provisions relate to the United Kingdom. So in Australia, of course, when the Constitution was written, it was one crown, and it was a British law that applied to the rules of succession to the throne. So there was nothing put into the Constitution allowing Australia to make laws about this sort of thing. But there was an escape hatch that they put into the Constitution, and this is section 5138. And it says that if it was something that only the British could legislate about at the time of federation, then you can legislate about it in Australia if you get legislation enacted by each of the states requesting the Commonwealth to make a law about it. So it's a federal exercise. And that's what we did. And in 2015, or leading up to 2015, when each of the states enacted a law to allow for changes of the rules of succession. So, for example, males don't take precedence over females. And so the states enacted the law requesting the Commonwealth to enact the law which changed the law of succession to the Crown of Australia in a way that was consistent with changes that were also made in the United Kingdom. Now, bizarrely, in Canada, which basically faced the same sort of issues, federal system, inherited British law, new crown for Canada, they decided that taking the same approach in dealing with Quebec was probably not something they really wanted to deal with, so they just took the view, oh, well, we just get whatever monarch the United Kingdom provides for us. We have some kind of a constitutional principle of synchronicity, which means that our monarch is exactly whoever it is who's the monarch of the United Kingdom, and we don't really have any say. Now, that was convenient from a political point of view, but could potentially turn out to be not such a great idea. Say, for example, hypothetically of course, the United Kingdom Parliament decided to legislate tomorrow and make someone else king, changing the rules of succession. Could they do that? Well, actually, yes, they could. So what if they legislated to say, maybe Boris Johnson will be the new king of the United Kingdom? Well, if they were remembering, by the way, that Boris Johnson once said his childhood ambition was to be king of the world. Okay, would that work? Well, in Australia, no, because Section 1 of the Australia Act 1986 says that a British law no longer operates as part of Australian law, and therefore it couldn't bind us. We would have to change our own rules of succession, with every state legislating to request the Commonwealth to legislate to make Boris Johnson our king, and I think that would be pretty unlikely. For Canada, however, given their existing view that they just get whoever is the king of or queen of the United Kingdom, then yes, it would make Boris Johnson immediately the king of Canada, which is a rather peculiar outcome. Anyway, getting back to the topic then of what does the coronation do? Well, it doesn't make the king of Australia. That's already happened, but for Australia, by virtue of Australia's laws of succession to the Australian crown. So is it then a coronation of King Charles as King of Australia, or is he really only being crowned as King of the United Kingdom? Well, again, this takes us back in history to this idea of a one indivisible crown, because the earlier coronations were all done on the basis of there being one crown for the entire empire. So if you go back to the 1911 coronation of King George V, for example, you'd find that the dominions, which is what the other countries like Australia, Canada, etc. were called at that time, those dominions were represented at the coronation by carrying standards, flags, in the procession, but it was really as a sign of empire. It was a sign of saying, look, here is our king, and he's not just king of the United Kingdom, but we have this massive empire and these are parts of it. So it wasn't a matter of being crowned separately king of those places. It was an indication that they were part of one empire. But 1937, with the crowning of King George VI, changed everything, because in between, you'd had that divisibility of the crown happening. You had the Statute of Westminster of 1931, which recognised that. And the consequence of that was that you had separate dominions of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, etc., which had separate crowns. So the view was taken that the king was crowned of all those places, and negotiations then were made to change the wording in parts of the ceremony to accommodate that. The first change to the coronation ceremony was to the part of the ceremony concerning the recognition. Previously, the recognition involved a declaration of the monarch as the undoubted king of this realm. Now, that was going to be a real problem if there were a whole lot of separate realms. So how to change that? And after quite a lot of negotiations, someone came up with a rather cunning statement instead of declaring King George your undoubted king. And that word your covered all the realms without having to specifically mention them. So that was quite a neat way of resolving the problem. The oath also needed to be changed because there is a requirement that the king commits to governing the United Kingdom according to its laws and customs. But now we have these separate realms. So in 1937, it was changed to say that the king would govern the peoples of Great Britain, Ireland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Union of South Africa, and the Empire of India, according to their respective laws and customs. Before the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, the same issue arose. Was she being crowned as Queen of all her realms or just of the United Kingdom? And interestingly, Winston Churchill answered that in Parliament. He said expressly that the Queen's coronation was not a coronation of her as solely Queen of the United Kingdom, that it was a coronation of the Queen as Queen of all her realms, and therefore the oath, for example, again had to be negotiated to accommodate that fact. In the oath, India, of course, was out, Pakistan and Ceylon were in. Australia and the other realms also contributed to the Queen's regalia for the first time. Now, the regalia is all the crowns and rings and sceptres and swords and those sorts of things that are presented to the monarch during the ceremony. Now, one of the things that traditionally had been presented to the monarch was known as an armel or armelae. They were golden bracelets put on the monarch, which were supposed to indicate sincerity and wisdom. Now, there'd been a translation error from a couple of hundred years back where they thought that armelae was actually a stole that you put onto the monarch, and so they hadn't used these golden bracelets for a long time. And when the Australian Prime Minister, Sir Robert Menzies, heard about that, he decided it would be a good idea for the different realms to contribute to the regalia of the monarch by creating new armels for Queen Elizabeth II. Which they did. They're quite beautiful. They're made of gold, they have engraving on them, and they have red velvet underneath so they don't scrape on the monarch's wrists. I've heard, however, that they're not expected to be used in this coronation. I'm not sure whether that's true, but it may well be that the armels that were made for Elizabeth II would not fit on the king because they were made for her specifically and she probably had smaller wrists. It may be that he's reverting to the armels that originally made for King Charles II, so that's something to look out for. Also, in terms of contributions, the state coach built in Australia will also be used to travel to the coronation for the King and the Queen. Apparently, it's a much better ride. It's actually got suspension, which makes you less likely to feel ill on your trip. Now, finally, to answer my original question, and that is the king then being crowned as King of Australia? And at least from the British perspective, the answer is yes. This is supposed to be a ceremony that crowns the king not only as King of the United Kingdom, but also as King of Australia and Papua New Guinea and King of Tuvalu and King of the Solomon Islands and King of New Zealand and all of the different realms. But whether it's really seen that way from the perspective of those countries, I doubt. I suspect that in Australia, when most people are watching the coronation, they'll be seeing it as the coronation of a British man becoming King of the United Kingdom with a few odd references to Australia and the other realms, but not really an Australian ceremony in which the king is made as King of Australia. What do you think? Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.